I have a new lens, and this lens is one I've been wanting to buy for a very long time. This is the Sony 200-600, and as you can see, it's pretty big. And I hope it's good because I've drove nearly 400 miles just to get this lens yesterday and another 100 miles to get here today. I've come all the way to Bempton Cliffs, hopefully to get some good wildlife photos. In this video, we're going to be looking at the features that this lens has. I'm going to be putting it through its paces with not only stationary subjects, but also birds in flight, which are going to be moving fast and changing direction. How sharp is this lens? Has it been worth the money, or more importantly, the 10-hour plus drive that I've made to go get this lens and take these photos? Or is it just an oversized paperweight that I'm going to regret buying and is going back on Facebook Marketplace in just a few minutes? And whilst I'm here, I'm hoping to get a photo of a puffin and an owl. That's all I want. That would be mission success. Wish me luck. So let's start with the specs. This lens provides one of the longest focal lengths from Sony's full frame lineup, and is packed with a nice variety of features as well. First up, the aperture is variable and goes from f5.6 when you're at 200mm, and as you zoom into 600, it will go to f6.3. And that isn't bad in terms of difference, because that's actually only a third of a stop, or one little notch on the aperture control. And it only stays at f5.6 for the first 100mm of the range, and once you get to around 300mm, it goes to f6.3. And because the aperture on this lens is probably much smaller than what you're used to, you're going to want to get out when there's plenty of sunlight. If you're wanting to photograph any wildlife or birds in flight, you're going to want to get your shutter speed to at least 1/1000, maybe even further. Pair that up with a smaller aperture and you'll easily find yourself shooting in the thousands when it comes to the ISO. But as long as you're using a camera which can deal with the higher ISOs, you should be okay, and you can always use noise reduction when it gets into Lightroom or Capture One. On the side of the lens, there's a couple of switches which I'm going to be going through shortly. But alongside them, we have the typical autofocus manual focus switch, which overrides the settings inside the camera. And finally, the focusing distance switch, which allows you to have some control over what distances your lens will focus at. This is particularly useful if you're wanting to shoot through something, let's say a fence. Some lenses and cameras will pick up that fence and want to focus on the fence when you're actually wanting to photograph the wildlife on the other side of the fence. However, you can stop this from happening by flicking the switch to the option of 10 meters to infinity, so anything from 10 meters and below closer to the lens, your camera will ignore it. This lens also has an internal zoom, so the actual lens physically doesn't get any longer or shorter as you zoom in or out, unlike the 100-400, which does. So let's talk about one of the most obvious things about the 200-600. The size. In fact, it's one of the main reasons I've never bought the lens until now. I've had to move a few things around in the camera bag to make it fit in, and yes, it does go in, but it's still pretty big. Maybe I'm being a little pathetic or pedantic, but this lens won't go in most camera bags. But now I physically have the lens and have used it, I don't actually mind it. It doesn't bother me anywhere near as much as I thought it would. And here's why. Apart from the size of it making me look like I actually know what I'm talking about, this lens is a very specialist lens. And in all honesty, if I'm wanting to take this lens out, there's a particular reason for it. A photo, a situation in mind that I expect to use this lens for. And for any general photos, you can just take a much smaller lens in the side of the bag with you, and you'll be fine. I definitely overthought it way too much. Also, the weight of it is around about 2.1 kilos, so you're gonna feel the weight of it when you're carrying it around. And if you're doing any kind of video work with it, a tripod, a monopod, somewhere to rest the lens is essential. The active stabilization in the camera does do a good job. However, at 600mm, you're still gonna get some jitters. This lens comes with the image stabilization that we see in many of the other telephoto lenses from Sony. And let's be fair, you'll pretty much have it on in any situation that you find yourself in. However, there are different modes that you can choose on the side of the lens depending on the situation you do find yourself in. But what do they do? Mode 1 is for the static photos, or generally just an all-rounder mode. Mode 2 is ideal for when you're photographing a subject and having to pan to keep it in frame. Think of motorsport photography. And mode 3 is ideal for situations where it's like birds in flight, when they have fast, erratic movement and you're having to move the camera around and the lens to keep it in frame. Puffin update for you. I've seen maybe 2, maybe 3 puffins so far. Got a photo, however, even with the 600, they're really low down. So I've got a photo, but it's not the photo, if you know what I mean. So far, I think I've taken maybe 400 photos. I've been testing the focus mainly with the birds flying through the air, diving down the edge of the cliff. And you know what? It's so good. I was looking at photos and I kind of just thought, wow, like, they're so sharp. And I actually have no idea why I didn't buy it sooner. I should have bought this a long time ago. It seemed that no matter where I pointed this lens, it locked onto the subject really well. On this one particular occasion, I held the lens up, started taking the photos, and then pressed the autofocus button just to see how many frames I would have to take before the camera would snap into focus. And sure enough, by the 4th photo, it was tack sharp. But one thing to note is I'm using the Sony A7R5, which has the updated focusing system. So there's a possibility that your results may differ depending on what kind of camera body you're using. Focusing doesn't just come down to the lens, it comes down to the camera body you're using as well. But between the two of them, I can get really sharp photos in situations I've not been able to get sharp photos in before. And out of the hundreds of photos I took, there's very few of them that weren't in focus, and I'm talking literally maybe just a handful. I did find myself stopping down in the aperture when the lighting situation allowed. The lens is still sharp wide open at f6.3, however, when looking at the photos on the back of the camera, and especially when I got into Lightroom, I feel like f9 seems to be the sweet spot. But like I say, f9 and f6.3, there's a bit of a jump there, so depending on what the lighting situation is like, you may not want to do that. Time for the final update of the challenge that I set myself. We already know that I got the photos of the puffins, but what about the barn owls? Well, here you go. It was a good bit of distance off. I've had to use every last bit of the sensor I can to get this photo. It may not be perfect, but I'm pretty pleased with it. I could sit there all day long watching them. So in that kind of situation when 600mm just isn't enough, what's the options you've got? You can always crop into your photo if your pixel count allows, which I do in some situations. For instance, on the A7R5, which has 61 megapixels, you can go into APS-C mode, achieve 900mm field of view, but not a true 900mm look, may I add, and still have around 26 megapixels to play with. If you don't want to crop into your photo, there is an alternative, which is a teleconverter. However, when you're using a teleconverter, a 1.4 times teleconverter will lose you a full stop of light in the aperture, and a 2 times teleconverter will lose you 2 stops. Or really the best option is to buy 400 or 600mm prime with a teleconverter, but that's going to set you back over 5 figures, so we'll pass on that option. Honestly, I really wish I'd have bought this much sooner than I have. It's faster focus and works really well with the camera. It gives a great image when it comes to the photos, and it's given me the opportunity to get some of the photos I've wanted for so long. I think when you can come back from a full day of photography and see great results on the laptop, but also know that you've had a great experience and you've been able to do everything that you want, it just proves that the lens is definitely worth it. Before I bought it, I was a little nervous. I bought it secondhand, but it wasn't exactly cheap, and I drove a long way to get it. But the moment I took the first few photos and looked on the back of the camera, I knew I'd made the right choice. However, you may still be thinking the 200 to 600 is just too big for you. Maybe you're wanting something a little bit more compact, especially if you're going to be doing some traveling. If that's the case, then I'd recommend checking out this video right here because I may have the solution. However, if you're into wildlife photography like I am and want to clean up the noise in your image when you're shooting at high ISOs, then that solution's just here. I'll see you soon.